Well, I want to thank you, Charles, for this opportunity, and I want to thank you all for being willing to listen to me. There is a lot that I have learned myself by doing this, because I knew something about the Reformation, but not much. And I knew a little bit about what happened at the Reformation when the Reformers approached the patriarchs in the East, in Constantinople, but I didn't know that much. So this was a great opportunity for me to learn more, and I thank God that I had this opportunity, and I thank God that I am able to be here to talk to you about it. It's a long paper, actually, and I'm going to try and get through it as quickly as possible. If you have questions, stop me at any point, and I will answer your questions to clarify whatever, but if you want to take notes while I'm talking and wait until the end, that will be fine as well. So, I would like to begin today by my presentation by pointing out that from the perspective of the Orthodox, and if anybody is not seeing me, please move yourself because I'm trying to make myself comfortable. From the perspective of the Orthodox of that time, the Reformation time, as well as the modern Orthodox people today, the Protestant Reformation is a purely Western Christian problem. Even today, most Orthodox still do not know much about it, both as to why it happened, as well as the intricacies of the issues and the theological diversity which subsequently arose out of that movement. Most Orthodox have no idea. But despite of that, I would also proceed to say that the first protesters against the ecclesiological and theological changes of Rome and the claims of supremacy by the papacy were actually the Eastern Christians. You may not know that, but we are the first Protestants. I'll explain. We were the first ones who objected and protested against papal overreaching, ecclesiological meddling, and the liturgical and theological innovations which began officially in the Western Church with King Charlemagne in the year 800 AD. Before that, for the previous 400 years, the West was in turmoil. There were invasions of the Germanic tribes, the Visigoths, the Goths, and all these others coming down into Europe and carving out the western part of Europe out of the Roman Empire, which in the East was not affected and continued for another 1,000 years. The West was destroyed, basically. Total destruction of education, of civilization. They lost their connection with the East. They lost the philosophers, the great philosophers, the Greek philosophers. They had to rediscover them at the time of Thomas Aquinas, much, much later. And they rediscovered Aristotle through the Arabs, actually, according to some accounts at least. Believe it or not. The West was in turmoil for 400 years. We call those the Dark Ages of Europe. And out of that comes Charlemagne, who tries to unite under his authority using the Roman Church. Because the only common thing that the Europeans still had after 400 years of turmoil, which the barbarians created, and he was one of the barbarians actually, he tried to utilize the church to unite an empire which he called Holy Roman Empire, but there was nothing holy about it, and there was nothing Roman actually, and he was not a Roman either. And that's when the division, the real division of the church begins. The division of the Eastern Church from the Western Church, or the Western Church from the Eastern Church. As Charlemagne was struggling to establish his Holy Roman Empire, after a period of nearly 400 years of political turmoil, chaos, and educational darkness in Western Europe, he began what was to become Roman Catholicism, which you're all basically inheritors of that, in one way or another. He first elevated and declared the Bishop of Rome, who was under his authority, to be the only representative of God on earth, and a supreme authority over all Christians everywhere. That was the way to unite the Holy Roman Empire into one empire. He also declared that the Eastern Romans, those of us in the East, we were all Greeks. which was a negative derogatory term which meant pagans. And we were all pagans unless he said they submitted to the authority of the Bishop of Rome and of course to his own authority as a Holy Roman Emperor. And that's what put the knife completely between the East and the West, starting at that time. At the same time, Charlemagne began to bring about more changes in the Western Church. He imposed the filioque. I will explain it if you don't know what it is. The filioque addition to the creed, which a lot of Protestants still use, even though it was a Roman incursion into the creed of faith. He imposed the filioque addition to the creed universally on the Western Church, in spite of the efforts of the last Roman Bishop Leo III, the one who crowned him actually Holy Roman Emperor, the last Roman Pope, who tried to preserve the creed unchanged by having it inscribed without the filioque on silver plaques and posting it on the walls of the Cathedral of St. Peter in Rome. But soon after his death, the plaques were removed and the filioque was enforced everywhere in the Western Church. Charlemagne proceeded also to impose the celibate priesthood, which the reformers complained about subsequently, and also the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist everywhere in the Western Church. Celibate priesthood was based on two items. The first one is that sexuality is unholy, it's unclean, sexuality is dirty. That's an Augustinian concept, which Luther inherited, and he had such trouble with all of these things until he renounced everything and cleansed himself from it. And of course, the other thing that Charlemagne enforced right now was the unleavened bread in the Eucharist, which was a theological kind of concept that the Carolingian theologians that he brought with him, the Frankish Carolingian theologians, actually thought up as the proper way to do the liturgy, because according to them, the Last Supper was a Paschal meal, a Passover meal, therefore it had to be unleavened bread. Well, the church up to this point always used leavened bread. But they questioned it and they changed it. From the Orthodox perspective, this was the time when the Roman Church turned away from orthodoxy and began to develop its own theology and ecclesiology, embarking on a journey that would lead to the Protestant rebellions of subsequent centuries. Within a few decades from Charlemagne's political moves, these changes precipitated a serious conflict between Rome and the Eastern churches in the so-called Photian Schism. This dispute was sparked by papal claims of supremacy and was further aggravated by a new realization by the Eastern bishops that the unilateral change to the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed was introduced in the Latin Church through the insertion of the filioque, which is the double procession of the Holy Spirit. At the point where you say, and I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father, they added, and from the Son. There is a story about that. If we have time, I can explain what that was and why it happened and how they found it and used it. The Eastern churches responded to these two problems by convening a major council in Constantinople in the years 879 to 880 to examine the issues. That was a major council which bishops from all over the East came to discuss the issues. The bishops of the East proceeded to officially reject the papal claims of supreme authority over the whole world and affirmed the restoration of St. Photius the Great, who was the Archbishop of Constantinople, who was ordered to be deposed by the Bishop of Rome. And the fathers of the council also anathematized anyone who altered the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, thus condemning the filioque addition to the creed by the Roman Church, stopping short from declaring Rome heretical by name. But that was their goal. Okay? This was a major council for the East and is considered the 8th Ecumenical Council. There were 7 before that Rome participated in. This one, Rome did not participate, and he was condemned by it. And the Orthodox call it still the 8th Ecumenical Council. This was the first time that the newly redefined and elevated See of Rome by Charlemagne was challenged and also condemned for its supremacy claims and its theological innovations by the entirety of the rest of the Christian world. Okay? And you're inheritors of that supremacy and process that happened, which the Protestant Reformers had to eventually overturn. But Rome completely ignored them. It split itself from the rest of Christianity. This was the official beginning of Christian protestation against the redefined papacy and its claims, which the reformers of the later centuries were to continue in their own way, for their own reasons, and from their own perspective, from within, hundreds of years later, of course. This condemnation of papal claims by the Eastern bishops occurred 2 entire centuries before they themselves understood fully, or began to understand actually, the extent to which the West had been changing. It was Cardinal Humbert who opened their eyes in 1054, revealing to them some of the main serious issues that had arisen in the West. This new realization of the chasm separating them from the Western Church was accompanied by an excommunication by Humbert of the entire Eastern Church. And we call this the Great Schism. Of course, he left Constantinople shaking the dust off his shoes, and the bishops of the East responded in kind, but still not much of this higher level conflict was known yet at the level of the people in the East. In the meantime, the Western Church began to develop its own salvation theology, based on a juridical approach drawing from an obscure Western tradition called the ransom bargain theory, which I assume that most of you would know about. Anselm of Canterbury, who lived between 1033 and 1109, the founder of scholasticism, stands out as a major contributor to this process by proposing a change to that ransom bargain theory called the debt or satisfaction theory of atonement, based on Augustine's understanding of the total depravity of man. A little later, Thomas Aquinas develops the theological methodology that will come to be known as Rationalism, based on the newly reintroduced works of Aristotle into the West. This is the time now that they rediscover Aristotle, pushing the Western Church further away from its mystical roots and in the direction of the rational philosophical approach to the Christian theology. In the meantime, in the East, they were using the philosophers all along, but they had separated philosophical thinking from Christian thinking. They were able to integrate whatever they could linguistically and in every other way into Christianity and merge the two in some way, but they never used Aristotelian methodology in Christianity because they understood that that is rationalistic, and they rejected all rationalistic aspects, although they were very rational and used rationality. Very interesting, right? So, it would take centuries for the East to understand these developments and ramifications, and even later, even at the time of the Reformers, the East had no idea about these things and how they had affected theology. But these newly developed theologies would be at the heart of the Reformation. The Reformers, they were immersed in this. They understood. That's the only thing they knew. That's the only thing they understood. They were shaped by what Thomas Aquinas did and what Anselm did, and they were shaped by what Augustine had said, because the Western Church had lost touch with the Eastern fathers, the ones who actually contributed to the Christological controversies of the 4th and 5th century, and to the controversies throughout the first 800 years of the Church. In the meantime, it was not until the end of the 11th century that the average Christian of the Eastern Church was to find out how they were viewed by Western Christians as Greeks and pagans. The soldiers of the First Crusade, who came to the East to free the Holy Lands from Muslim domination, thinking that their sins might be forgiven by participating in this holy war, not a very different concept from what the Muslims understand as jihad, treated the Eastern Christians at times as badly as they treated the Muslims, and they finally left them at the mercy of the Muslims, of the Muslim wrath, as they returned back to their homelands. This was the beginning of the destruction of Eastern Christianity in the Middle East. The First Crusade was the first influence in that direction. And yet it was not until 1204, almost 100 years later, that the Christians of Constantinople now truly found out firsthand about what had happened to Christianity and the Christians in the West. The soldiers of the Fourth Crusade, bearing the cross of Christ on their shields and armor, instead of heading for Jerusalem to free it from the Muslims as they had announced, entered the unsuspecting city of Constantinople. And the result was disastrous. Their disrespect for Eastern Christians, their way of life and their worship traditions was exemplified in the shameful sack and looting of the imperial city, its churches and palaces, and all the things that they had, which most of them are found in Venice. If you go to Venice, it's full of artifacts from Constantinople of that time, including the two huge horses in front of the Church of St. Mark's, the bronze horses that they took from the hippodrome. And they enslaved the Eastern Christians for about 50 years of the Latin domination, as we call it, which brought about the destruction of what was still remaining of the Eastern Christian Roman Empire, weakening it further in the face of the advancing Turks, and thus opening the doors for its final demise. This is the background which an Orthodox Christian brings along every time he or she engages with the Protestant Reformation and the Western theological understandings, recognizing as an internal rebellion against the medieval papacy and its novelties, but also feeling the bitter taste of the same fruits of corruption as they were first experienced in the East before they were even experienced in the West, hundreds of years earlier. As I recently read for the first time the story of the execution of Jan Hus in 1415 by the papal authorities in Constance, Germany, and we're going to visit his church, I guess, not the place where he was executed, but the church where he preached. I was reminded of the 13 monks of Kantara of Cyprus, a monastery in Cyprus. We did not go to Kantara, and I don't think you did. It's under the Turkish occupation today, which happened some 200 years before Jan Hus in Cyprus, where Cyprus was overrun by the Franks, and then after the Franks came the Venetians, and it was under the Latins, as we call them, for 500 years, suffered terribly. They were ready for the Turks when the Turks invaded and took Cyprus. Not that it was much better, but it was much better ecclesiastically. The Turks allowed them to worship the way they wanted. The Latins didn't. So what happened? These 13 monks were burned alive after being subjected to months of tortures by the Frankish Roman Catholic overlords in Nicosia, Cyprus, just because they rejected the supremacy of the Pope of Rome and refused to use unleavened bread in the Eucharist. So we have our heroes in that way too, that fell and suffered under Latin rule. On the Constantinopolitan front, on the other hand, the rise of Islam, and especially the rapid advancement of the Ottoman Turks in the East, pushed the Emperor of Constantinople and the Eastern bishops to seek the help of the Christians of the West, middle of the 15th century, 1400s, right? As the Turks were advancing and were becoming a greater menace, the Emperor of Constantinople and all the bishops, they went to the West begging the Pope of Rome and the kings of Europe to help them to stop the Oriental aggressor. Just a few years after the execution of Jan Hus, the Eastern bishops found themselves begging their Western brothers for military assistance to defend their lands and churches. Instead of brotherly hospitality, however, they received the humiliating and demeaning treatment at the councils of Ferrara and Florence between 1438 and 1445, where after being subjected to psychological and political pressures for months, they surrendered to Rome's claims of papal supremacy, hoping that the Eastern Empire would receive military help from the West as promised. And the papal authorities always used that as, even with Luther, They used this in the debate with Luther, that, oh, look at the East, they surrendered to the West, to the Pope. As they returned to their sees, however, after suffering months of severe hardships, the bishops were confronted by violent demonstrations from the members of their flocks, who saw what they did as a theological and ecclesiological capitulation to a corrupt and heretical Vatican. In addition, the promised military assistance from the West never arrived. And you know what happened. In the meantime, as internal unrest was brewing for Rome, the Hussites, who were going through their own rebellion against the papal authorities, began to make overtures to the Orthodox. A very little known event. A Bohemian whom the Greeks knew as Constantine Platris and surnamed him the Englishman, came to Constantinople in 1451, right before the fall of the city to the Turks, with letters addressed to the Orthodox authorities. A synod could not be convened at that time because the patriarch see was vacant. The patriarch of Constantinople was actually removed because he was pro-papal. But the synaxes of the bishops, which came together, proved sympathetic with the reformers and exchanged friendly letters with them, full of renunciations of Roman pretensions. The negotiations, however, were interrupted by the fall of the city to the Turks, which happened a little more than a year later on May 25 of 1453. Hence, most Eastern Christians of the 15th and 16th centuries, even as they sat under the heavy burden of Muslim domination, would not have been surprised to hear of the rebellion against the papacy and the objections raised by people like John Wycliffe in England, Jan Hus in Bohemia, and finally Martin Luther in Germany. Actually, if it was in our own world today, if they had been able to watch on their evening news like we do today, what was happening in Europe at the time, they would have probably said, it was about time you woke up. But at that time, communications were scarce and not as immediate as they are today. Events were experienced in isolation, and it would take decades and even centuries in some cases before people would even know what happened across their borders. The German reformers. One would wonder what the German reformers thought of the Eastern Christians. I find it quite interesting that Luther, even though when driven by his powerful emotions, had expressed negative feelings toward the Greek-speaking Christians of the East, when swayed by his powerful mind, he expressed himself more kindly for the Greeks. After all, he knew well that the New Testament was written in Greek. Bible, sola scriptura. It was all in Greek. It was the Greek bishops who decided what was scriptures. Right? 4th century. Scriptures did not fall from the skies. Somebody had to decide what is scripture. He knew very well that the bishops of the East were the ones who knew and decided what was scripture, what was New Testament, and what was not. He also was a devoted student of the early Greek fathers. And there's a lot about that, but I'm not going to get into it today. In his disputation with Johann von Eck, who claimed that the Greek Church was heretical because of its reputation of the Roman authority and because they had already surrendered to the Pope and things like that, further trying also to justify his claims by saying that the Eastern Church had produced many heretics like Nestorius, Eutyches, and others, Luther sternly responded that the Greeks were not heretics because they had not changed their position with regard to Rome. In fact, they had never from the earliest days accepted the supremacy of Rome, he said. As for heretics, Luther explained, Rome had also produced its own share of them, like the Pelagians, Manichaeans, and Jovinians. The Greek Church, he concluded, represents the true tradition of early Christianity in a far better way than did the theologians of Rome. And he said a lot of other positive things about the Greek Church. They called it the Greek Church, the Eastern Church. It is a fact that Luther showed no interest in building a relationship with the Eastern Christians. But his disciples, true children of the Renaissance, which had already started and was moving on, had a greater inclination in building relationships with the East. Philip Melanchthon, the most distinguished, and I was so pleased. I thought that he was really pushed to the side, but I was so pleased to find his statue next to Luther and his grave next to Luther's, and he's the second in line, and I was delighted because I love Philip Melanchthon. He was the most distinguished of his disciples and a professor of Greek at the University of Wittenberg, was deeply interested in Hellenism, ancient and contemporary. And he saw a significant value in establishing a relationship with the Greek Church. He also understood the suffering of the Eastern Christians under the Muslims. And he was very sympathetic about that. So Melanchthon might also intended to gain the support of the Eastern Church in the Reformers' theological and ideological struggle against Rome. And that would have been a natural way to think. So his efforts began. But his efforts did not prove as fruitful as he had hoped. The first person he entrusted in helping him with this endeavor was James Basilicus, who proved to be a liability rather than an asset. James Basilicus went on to become a ruler in the Principality of Moldavia under the title of John I. Moldavia was actually an Orthodox land, and this guy wanted to reform it and make it Protestant, to make it Lutheran. And in his effort to do that, he appointed a Polish man, a Polish Protestant, Jan Luzyski, as Archbishop of Moldavia. Luzyski surprised and shocked the Orthodox people of Moldavia because he brought along his wife. And Orthodox bishops do not get married. They're chosen from among the monks. And then he proceeded to reform the church along Lutheran lines, pushing also for the abolishment of icons from the churches and the dissolution of monasteries, which the Christians of Moldavia were very upset about. And Moldavia was under the influence of Constantinople, so when of course, anything that was happening there was transmitted to Constantinople. There is abundant evidence that the proselytizing activities of both Protestants as well as Roman Catholics in the Eastern European principalities populated by Orthodox Christians worried the Patriarchate of Constantinople at that time. This might have actually undermined Melanchthon's efforts to gain the trust of Eastern Christian leadership, especially the then Patriarch Joasaph II, who, according to James Basilicus, was his own cousin. If Joasaph knew of Basilicus' activities, which he probably did, he would have been very hesitant to trust the Lutherans. So perhaps that's the reason that he never responded to the overtures from Melanchthon, and I'm going to get into that in a moment. In the end, Melanchthon managed to at least have his communication delivered to Constantinople. An elderly Digon from Montenegro by the name of Demetrius, a Lutheran sympathizer, friend of Basilicus, came to him with an introduction from Basilicus. An earlier version then of the Augsburg Confession was translated, okay? And you know the importance of Melanchthon in the Augsburg Confession. So he took the version from probably 1531, and he had it translated, rather interpreted into Greek. And he gave it to Demetrius to deliver to the Patriarch, along with a cover letter from Melanchthon suggesting that the Lutheran and Greek churches had much in common. This Greek version is of a peculiar character, as it used an Eastern Orthodox theological idiom. The language, the Greek language that was used, was the language of the people of that time, and the words and the expressions and the theological terms were Eastern terms, which in some cases they were trying to find Latin words or Greek words to translate the Latin. They couldn't. So the question is, how did he was able, how was Melanchthon able to have such an amazing text that spoke the language of the East? Well, we think that it was Demetrius who helped him do this. Melanchthon's scholarly work is apparent in the text, but he must have received help from Demetrius, to whom this Greek idiom came naturally. It was his own language, it was his own theology that he understood. In translating terms, like for example, original sin, they used the Greek terms, which don't mean the same thing, of course, as the Latin terms in Latin theology, because the original sin concept comes from Augustine. The Eastern Church did not have Augustine's understanding. Augustine ignored what they was talking about and had his own developed, which was totally different. And I can explain further if you want later. As an Orthodox professor speaks about, Father George Florovsky, he refers to Ernst Benz, who studied the Greek version of the Augsburg Confession. And he suggested that the translators deliberately toned down the forensic or juridical tenor of the Latin Augustana doctrine of redemption. Okay? Indeed, at many points, the translators could not easily find in current Greek theological vocabulary exact equivalents to the Latin terms. But there was much more than that. There was an obvious desire to adjust the exposition of the traditional convictions of the Greek Church, to adjust the exposition to the traditional convictions. They were trying to make it seem as if they were on the same page. As Benz further suggested, the whole exposition is transposed from the dimension, and this is a German word which I am not quite sure I can pronounce it, Rechtfertigungsreligion, into the dimension of Erlösungsreligion. Forgive me. Instead of the concept of justification, the dominant idea in the Greek version is that of healing, which is the Orthodox understanding of salvation. Okay, there's a lot more in my footnotes, but I don't think we have enough time to go into any of that. Florovsky also explains the main tendency of the Greek version of the Augustana was to avoid the use of scholastic phraseology, which was alien to the East, and to tone down the Western emphasis on the forensic aspect of the doctrine of salvation. Emphasis was shifted from justification to forgiveness. Okay? Forgiveness to life eternal, a new birth, a regeneration, and the resurrection, which was ignored in the scholastic literature. It was a substitution, as it were, of the Johannine idiom to the Pauline idiom. Again, the dogma itself was treated rather from the point of view of worship than simply as a piece of scholastic doctrine. But the question arises, if indeed Melanchthon was the mastermind behind the Greek text, was he acting based on the desire to either please the Eastern Patriarch, to deceive him, and thus misrepresent the Reformers' faith, or was he genuinely close to the Orthodox doctrines? Good question. That requires a PhD thesis, a PhD dissertation, I think. If I do my second PhD, I'm going to go for it. It seems to me that this transposing of the Augustana to a Greek idiom, which would make better sense to the Eastern bishops and theologians, was a great achievement for Melanchthon, both linguistically as well as theologically. Through this, he himself managed to transcend his scholastic, juridical, and legalistic training and adopt a more patristic, mystical approach to the critical theological issues at hand. He was an avid student of the Greek fathers, and especially of St. John Chrysostom, and he was familiar with the Eastern approach to salvation, including the concept of synergy, synergia, cooperation between man and God, and sanctification or theosis, or deification of man in the image and likeness of God. It was perhaps this personal affiliation and comfort with Eastern patristic doctrine that gave him the confidence to try to reassure Patriarch Joseph in his cover letter that the Reformers were very close to the Orthodox. So my question is, was Melanchthon Orthodox? I will do another study for that. I'll let you know. With a special Greek version of the Augsburg Confession and Melanchthon's letter to the Patriarch in hand, Demetrios embarked on his journey to Constantinople in late 1559. So the letter went off with the Greek version of the Augsburg Confession. He arrived, Melanchthon died in the meantime, before an answer could have been brought back. His associates waited for months for the reply. When none was received, they all assumed that the letter was never delivered. But in fact, Demetrios arrived in Constantinople at the end of 1559, and he was received by the Patriarch. But as the Byzantine historian Stephen Runciman suggests, the documents which Demetrios had brought embarrassed Joasaph and the Holy Synod. A brief glance at the Confession of Augsburg showed that much of its doctrine was frankly heretical. But it would be undesirable to spoil relations with a potential friend. Now, these are Christians under the Muslims who are suffering terribly, and they're looking to the West to get help. So they don't want to have a conflict with other Christians who might be able to help them. So the Patriarch and his advisors took refuge, according to Runciman, in the favorite device of Oriental diplomacy. When you don't like something, you ignore it. They behaved as if they had never received the communication, which they carefully mislaid. Demetrios waited for 2 or 3 months, and when he could not receive a reply to bring back to Wittenberg, he left Constantinople, but instead of returning to Germany with empty hands, he headed for Transylvania, where his friend Basilikos was. There he spent the next 3 years trying to introduce Lutheranism into Orthodox Transylvanian villages. And then after James Basilikos' fall from power, Demetrios continued his efforts for Lutheran propaganda in Slav dominions of the Habsburg Emperor, where he finally died. Melanchthon's efforts of rapprochement with the Orthodox failed, but his spirit, the spirit of that rapprochement desire, remained in the next generation of Lutheran scholars in Germany, who seized the opportunity when it was offered to them, and they tried again. In 1570, the imperial ambassador of Habsburg emperors to Constantinople, his name was David von Ungnat, he was a Lutheran. He brought along with him to the city an eminent Lutheran scholar by the name of Stephen Gerlach, who had a close relationship with the University of Tübingen. He studied there, he did his work there. Through a personal friendship with the assistant to the Patriarch, the protonotarius of the great church, Theodosios Zygomalas, Gerlach managed to be introduced to the new Patriarch. So Gerlach now is this theologian, Lutheran theologian from Tübingen. In return, he was the chaplain for the embassy. In return, Gerlach introduced Zygomalas to the leading scholars in Germany, and at the time, Martin Kraus, or Crucius of Tübingen was the one, and they started having communications about Greek, about the Greek language, about the use of certain Greek words, about the ancient Greek cities, about things of interest to the scholars in Tübingen. Through Zygomalas, however, Crucius entered into correspondence with Patriarch Jeremias, whom he greatly admired. In 1574, at the urging of Gerlach, the ambassador Ungnat wrote to Germany asking for fresh copies of the Greek Augsburg Confession. And this time the Germans took no chances. First time they sent one, it was lost. This time they sent 6 copies to different people. And in addition to that, they made an extra copy in Armenian and sent it to Armenia. Let everybody have it. To Georgia, actually. 7th copy, translated to Georgian, was sent to the Church of Georgia. Armenia was not in communion with the other Eastern churches. The Patriarch's copy was prefaced by a letter from the German divines claiming that the reformers had introduced no innovations into the principal things necessary for salvation and were true to the faith as taught by the apostles, the prophets, and the holy fathers, inspired by the Holy Spirit, the 7 councils and the Holy Scriptures. The Reformers were requesting union with Eastern churches, claiming that they themselves were holding on to the Orthodox faith. They actually introduced at the top a confession of Orthodox faith, which was not in the original Augsburg Confession. Again, however, the letter had the same effect on the Orthodox recipients. The Confession of Augsburg, even in its special transposition in the Greek version, was as embarrassing now as it was 15 years earlier. The problem, however, for Jeremias, the patriarch now, was that he could not ignore it as Josaph had done before, because he was surrounded by these friends. He tried to stall as much as possible in answering, but Ungnad and Gerlach were right there putting pressure on him. He finally wrote a short and polite letter to Tübingen, thanking the divines and promising to answer in full in the near future. When his delaying tactics could not work much longer, he finally, after consulting with the Holy Synod, summoned the help of Zygomalas and his father John, Zygomalas' father John, and composed a full answer to the various points raised in the confession. The letter was dated May 15, 1576, and was sent off to Tübingen. The Greek Augsburg Confession contains 21 articles. Jeremias addressed each one, and then he added 8 additional chapters, enumerating again his main objections and offering clarifications. A long document, it's an entire book. I have it all in English. If you're interested, I'll point it out to you. And all the responses, the whole conversation. I have actually, I'm not going to go through all of the 21 points. I have actually made a short, an appendix of a short summary of his responses to the 21 articles and the 8 further chapters of his communication to the German divines. And I'm going to give it to you after we finish to take with you to study on your own. It's not everything, it's just highlights. But it gives you a good idea of what was exchanged. Basically, Jeremias rejects some of the assertions of the Reformers, including the idea of justification by faith alone, and warns against anything that may lead to the doctrine of predestined election, because the Reformers are very close to that. He also, and Calvin, of course, went right into it eventually. He also points to the various changes that the West has introduced into the Christian faith. Not just the Reformers, but Rome. So the Greeks are still in the, well, there's plenty of stuff that you guys still do which we disagree with. We condemn them already. He points to the various changes, like the addition of the filioque to the creed, baptism without tribal immersion. Okay? Do you guys do tribal immersion? 3 times? In the name of the Father, of the Son, of the Holy Spirit? Some say yes, some say no. Depends where you are. Well, some of the Reformers, I guess, they listened to the Eastern Patriarchs and they changed it. He insists that the number of the sacraments is 7. Even though in the East it was not decided, it was never really decided that the sacraments are 7. We see the sacraments much more than 7. For example, a funeral is a sacrament, and is only given to Orthodox Christians. The blessing of the water on Epiphany, on the baptism of Christ, is a sacrament for us. And several others. The tonsure of a monk or a nun into the life of the monastic life is a sacrament for us. And the concept of sacrament is different in the East than it is in the West. I'm not quite sure exactly how it is in the West, so I'm not going to venture into saying because there are so many ideas. But in the East, a sacrament is called a mystery, mysterion, which means a mystical event where something happens where God gets involved in our lives directly to change something from unholy to holy. Okay? To transform us, to make us closer to Him. That's a sacrament. And it's a mystery because we cannot really comprehend it rationalistically, in a rational way. So he insists that the number of sacraments is 7, focuses on the importance of the sacraments, and the celebration of feasts as sources of sanctification for the faithful and aids to salvation. He focuses especially on the Eucharist, both as a sacrament for sanctification and also as a sacrifice, which the Reformers refused to acknowledge, and criticizes the Latin omission of the invocation of the Holy Spirit to change the gift to the bread and the wine from bread and wine and make them the body and blood of Christ. In the East, we still have that. I believe the Vatican II decided to bring the invocation of the Holy Spirit. I'm not sure if they do it everywhere, and I doubt that the Protestant Reformers have it in the Eucharistic celebration. Epiclesis, the invocation of the Holy Spirit to change the bread and the wine and make it the body and blood of Christ. In response to the idea of sola scriptura, the Patriarch continually throughout his response invokes the Fathers of the Church as authorities for the interpretation of the Scriptures and for the expounding of theology and praxis. He is not giving personal opinions, nor can he accept anyone's opinion if it contradicts the Fathers. This is essential to the Orthodox, since even heretics have appealed to the Holy Scriptures in support of their positions and their errors. And he says, not anyone could just interpret the Scriptures because he wants to interpret the Scriptures. There is a consensus of the holy people who have gone before us, who have done this, and we need to be within the consensus which was ratified by the great councils of the Church. And that's how the truth is transmitted. You don't just create your own truth because you like it that way and it pleases you that way. So the Scripture is the Scriptures is the book of the Church as a whole, not of you alone. So you don't have the right to interpret the Scriptures by yourself. The Scriptures are interpreted within the community of the faithful as they worship through the centuries, not just today. So if you are in conflict with the previous generations of Christians who interpreted the Scriptures in a certain way, you are off, you're out. And especially those decisions and those understandings that were ratified by the great councils, the 8 great councils, not just 7. This is essential to the Orthodox. The final closing paragraph of Jeremiah's response is an invitation of the Patriarch. This is very interesting how he does it. It's an invitation of the Patriarch to the German reformers in love and affection. If they really wish to enter the Orthodox Church with their whole heart, he says, to follow the apostolic and synodal decrees in harmony with the Orthodox themselves and submit to the same ones as the Orthodox submit to them. And then he concludes, for then you will indeed be in communion with us, and having openly submitted to our holy and Catholic Church of Christ, you will be praised by all prudent men. In this way, the two churches will become one by the grace of God. We shall live together in God's pleasing way until we attain the heavenly kingdom. Florovsky, an Orthodox theologian, points out that Jeremiah's document was meant to not disturb the peace, and possibly for that very reason was also not very convincing. It was not a very strong document. He goes on to suggest that the modern reader might even think that it's evasive and non-committal. Jeremiah's purpose was clearly not to criticize, but rather expound a sound doctrine, as he understood it. Hence, he avoided addressing seriously the most important points of divergence, namely church, ministry, and the doctrine of justification. He just alluded to them, but he didn't go deeply into them. I think he also didn't understand fully where the reformers were coming from. We do have to bear in mind, however, that in the East, very little was known of the Reformation, as well as Western theology, as it had developed by this time, and Jeremiah might have underestimated the extent of the seriousness of the issues from a doctrinal point of view. Of course, he didn't really understand the objections of the reformers against the papacy, which were not relevant to the Orthodox, indulgences and purgatory and those things which I think the reformers were coming from that direction, and he did not get it. He did not really realize how important those issues were for the reformers. The reply reached Germany in the summer of 1576. One can imagine the disappointment of the German divines. Crucius summoned Lucius Osiander, and together they composed a response in which they were attempting to elucidate the main points in the Augsburg Confession that the Patriarch was objecting to. But they avoided the issues raised by him regarding leavened bread, the liturgy, and monasticism. Their letter was written in 1577, but probably did not reach Constantinople until the following year, 1578. Once again, Jeremias stalled and avoided to write a response, but under pressure again from Gerlach, he finally did. His tone this time was less conciliatory. He pointed out the doctrines which the Orthodox could not accept. The dual procession of the Holy Spirit, the filioque, which the Reformers didn't care, it was an issue for them, and their views, he opposed their views on free will and justification by faith alone. He repeated that there are 7 sacraments, not just 2, and reaffirmed his understanding that it is good to invoke the saints for intercession and give veneration to holy icons and holy relics. I do a lot more in the handout I'm going to give you on those things, so you need to read that and get some of the understandings. The letter was sent in May 1579. Upon receipt, the Lutheran divines composed a further reply, which was dispatched in June of 1580. Their tone was very conciliatory. Without yielding on any points, however, the authors tried to convince Jeremias that the doctrinal differences on the issues he was raising were only matters of terminology. The Patriarch responded, perhaps they didn't understand either what he was talking about. The Patriarch responded for the last time in the summer of 1581. This time, he recapitulated the points of disagreement and begged for the correspondence to cease. Go your way, he said, and do not send us further letters on doctrine, but only letters written for the sake of friendship. In spite of Jeremiah's plea, the Lutheran Committee sent one more letter, almost identical to the last. The Patriarch did not reply. Yet the friendly relations and correspondence between Jeremias, Zygomalas, and Crucius continued, but only with respect to topics like Greek linguistic usages and the present condition of the ancient Greek sites. The Byzantine historian Stephen Runciman, an Englishman, he writes and judges the exchange in the following way. It is difficult to see how any real union between the Orthodox and the Lutheran churches could have been achieved. The Lutherans had not rid themselves of the superstitions of Rome in order to unite with the church, whose devotion to saints and images and monastic vows must have seemed quite as idolatrous. To the Orthodox, the Lutherans seemed to combine, on the other side to the Orthodox, the Lutherans seemed to combine certain Roman errors with an unsound evangelism and a regrettable taste for iconoclasm. That's Runciman. Their chief common ground was a mutual dislike of the papacy, and that was hardly a sufficient bond. I have no doubt that both patriarchs of Constantinople, Joseph II and Jeremias II, were sympathetic to the Reformers' cause when they received their letters, because they themselves had some of the same objections about the papacy and its modifications of theology and praxis. But having themselves been steeped in the mystical and apophatic theology and worship of the East, they probably also knew that the Reformers were children of a fundamentally different way of thinking, with deep roots in a rather legalistic and rationalistic approach to the Christian mystery of salvation, as it had been cultivated for the past 4 centuries in the West. So they hesitated to respond, perhaps sensing also the difficulty of communicating their own very different perspective, but also not wanting to insult by disagreeing with them. Most probably both patriarchs from the beginning did not see any possibility of union of the two sides. Joseph never responded for these reasons. Jeremiah stalled as much as he could, but was forced to do it in the end for the sake of friendship. And then we have one more case. So please bear with me. A very interesting one. The case of the Calvinist patriarch, Cyril Lucaris. Here we also see the Western conflict brought to the East. And we also see a classic example of political intrigues of Western diplomats as they meddle with the Christian East, which is now all under the Ottoman Empire. While the proselytization of Orthodox Christians in Eastern Europe was underway by both Protestants and Roman Catholics, in Constantinople, which was now under the rule of the Ottoman Turks, a different game was being played with political intrigues of Western diplomats of both sides, the Roman Catholic and the Protestants, in order to influence the Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians and win them over to their camp. And there is two elements to this. One, they want to convert them, and the other is that they want to have them be friends at least so that they can fight the other side. The war is going on in the West. The Jesuits, in the meantime, were established, and they were sent to the East, where they unleashed a campaign to proselytize the Greeks through the establishment of schools. Jesuits are very good with schools. Education was not easily available to the poor and oppressed Christians under Ottoman rule. The Jesuits had both the money and other resources to offer it. In addition, their presence in the East, and especially in the imperial city of Constantinople, gave the Jesuits access to power and opportunities for affecting the Turkish Ottoman policies as well. In the autumn of 1620, a new patriarch by the name of Cyril Lugaris, who was educated in the West, mostly in Italy, I believe, and had Protestant leanings because he despised the Roman Catholics, ascended the throne of Constantinople when the pro-Vatican Patriarch Timothy, the Patriarch at the time was pro-Vatican, right? But he died suddenly after a dinner party given by Cornelius van Hack, the Dutch ambassador, a Protestant, who was also Cyril's friend. Did you get that? Well, the Jesuits, aiming at swaying the Greek bishops from choosing Cyril, immediately circulated the rumor that the ambassador had poisoned Timothy, the patriarch, in order to open the throne to Cyril, who was a Lutheran, who was, I guess, pro-Lutheran. But they failed to prevent Cyril's election. They failed to prevent Cyril's election and his elevation, so Cyril Lugaris becomes the Patriarch of Constantinople. Now, the new Patriarch had received his education in Italy and had full knowledge of the Western debates of theology. His preference turned to the Protestant approach, which appealed to his active and inquisitive mind, and which also seemed refreshing and forward-looking, because he had energy in it. It was dynamic. I mean, you can imagine the energy and the zeal of the Protestants at that time, in comparison to the more settled Roman Catholics, and even in the East, the settled Orthodox. So his reputation as a sympathizer with the Reformers had been a very positive one among the European Protestants for a number of years, because of his communications with key Protestant theologians in Europe, to whom he had revealed his Protestant leanings, and there are several letters which reveal that, which you can find them if you want. This side of Cyril, however, was still unknown to the Eastern bishops. The Eastern Christians had no idea that the new patriarch had Protestant leanings. The Jesuits, on the other hand, with their connections all over Europe, knew very well on the reputation of Cyril as a pure Calvinist, and declared war against him. They first sought to embarrass him by feeding this information to the more conservative bishops of the Greek Church in order to cause him trouble. The Patriarch, however, had the support of Sir Thomas Roe, the English ambassador, and Cornelius van Hack, the Dutch ambassador, two very influential personalities at this time in Constantinople. The Jesuits, nevertheless, with the help of Comte Cessy, the French ambassador, contrived a series of intrigues involving both the pro-Vatican Greek bishops as well as the Grand Vizier of the Turks, and they managed to depose Cyril. The plan did not work as well as they hoped, however, so Cyril returned back to his see. There is a lot of information about this which I kind of glanced over. It's not important for this, but the intrigues going back and forth, and he's raised up, he's torn down, he's raised up again, he's brought down 5 times, I believe. The war against Syrilugaris by the Roman Catholics took now a new face. The Congregatio de Propaganda Fide was now summoned by Pope Urban VIII. And I don't know what that is, but you might know because it must have affected your... it was a committee that the Pope had put together to do propaganda wherever they could about the Roman faith. He brought that committee together to decide what they would do with Cyril. A Greek Catholic by the name of Canaccio Rossi was dispatched to Constantinople. He in turn devised new intrigues with the help of the Jesuits, again involving the Grand Vizier, but the plan backfired completely this time. The Grand Vizier, who understood what the Jesuits were doing, ordered the Jesuits to be expelled from all the Sultan's dominion, and he yelled at the French ambassador and said to him, if you cannot be an ambassador in a foreign country, get out of here. Okay? Cyril Luger is feeling now more at ease, published a book with the title Confession of Faith, where he laid out his theology in 18 articles. The positions were more in line with Calvinistic theology rather than with anything appearing in Jeremiah's response to the Augsburg Confession. Luger's confession created an immediate storm among the Orthodox, which brought about a new series of intrigues involving the pro-Latin Greek bishops, the European embassies, the Sultan, and the Vatican. Everybody was in this now. And of course, this series of events would end in multiple depositions and reinstallments of Cyril as patriarch, pronouncements of anathemas against his theology and his person, and finally, his strangling by the Turkish soldiers on the way to his exile on June 25, 1638. The conflict among the European Christians was finally brought to the East. Lugeris saw himself as a reformer. He wanted to bring the Orthodox Church more in line with the livelier Protestant churches of Europe. The hard logical intellectualism of Calvinism attracted the realistic and cerebral side of Cyril's Greek character. But Cyril misunderstood his own church. This misunderstanding is summed up in Stephen Runciman's conclusion. But the Greek character has its other side, its taste for the mysteries. The Greek is a mystic as well as an intellectual, and the Orthodox Church derived much of its strength from its own mystical tradition. Its power of survival through worldly disasters, and I would say the 400 years under the Muslims, was largely in its acceptance of the transcendent mystery of the divine. God never left them, and they never left him. Through the divine liturgy, the mystical ascent to heaven and the bringing heaven to earth, they were able to survive as Christians and as Greeks under the Muslims. Those who converted to Islam disappeared as ethnic groups, but the Greeks survived. And they kept their language too, through the liturgy. This kind of thing Cyril misunderstood. He never understood it. To him and his followers, the apophatic approach. Apophatic is when you say, I don't know, that's the mystery. I'm not sure, I leave it up to God. Like, for example, with the conversion of the gifts from bread and wine to the body and blood of Christ, the Orthodox never use the term transubstantiation. They just say it changes. We don't know how. It's a mystery. That's why we call it mysterion, the sacrament. To Cyril and his followers, the apophatic approach led merely to ignorance and stagnation. That's what they thought it was. He could not appreciate the sustaining force of tradition. You know, if Luther, we asked the question, if Luther had come to this church yesterday, would have he recognized most of that service? And the answer is probably not fully. If Joseph the Patriarch or Jeremiah the Patriarch who have come to an Orthodox church today, he would hear the same language, the same hymns, the same order, exactly as he did it at his time. That's the tradition of the Orthodox. Even St. John Chrysostom of the 4th century, if he walked into an Orthodox church today, he will recognize the exact service he was doing 1600 years ago. Now that's the force of tradition. And the Orthodox churches are ethnic churches. They are divided among themselves ethnically. You go to Romania, everything is in Romania. You go to Russia, everything is in Russia. They even have their little traditions. But when I went to Russia last summer and I went into the liturgy, I was there. I knew exactly where we were. And the priest next to me even knew the Greek, and he would say the Greek to me because everything was in Russian, and I would say my part in Greek. It's exactly the same service. The tradition has held us together. That's the power of tradition that most Protestants don't realize how powerful it is. There is diversity, and yet there is a core tradition which holds us together. And you can see how the Orthodox came together in Crete last summer, but 4 of the major churches didn't join them. You know why? Because they said, you guys are going too far. You can't change. You can't change anything. You're not going to change anything until we all agree. Okay? Because if you split off, then we will reject you and you will not be in communion. And that's important for the Orthodox. As a priest, I will never say anything that will be heretical in the sense of renouncing. You go to, and I'm going to give you the example of the Anglican Church that I found out in Atlanta recently, where they decided to change the creed, to actually give up on the creed and not say it. If you do that in an Orthodox Church, you're in trouble. The Bishop of Atlanta brought in a Muslim woman to read the Gospel in a Eucharistic celebration, and then he commemorated Muhammad as a prophet in the Eucharistic prayers. That will never happen in the Orthodox Church. But that's where Protestantism has gone. It's everybody does whatever they want, and it's okay as long as you don't bother me. And that's not how the church held itself together over the centuries. So the logic of Geneva was no better an answer to the problems of the Orthodox than was the disciplined legalism of Rome, because they all led to another direction. In reaction to Lugaris, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Dositheos, in his confession adopted by the Synod of Jerusalem in 1672, affirms the sacredness of the divine authorship of the Bible, because the Bible is at the center of our worship and at the center of our understanding. But the Bible is the Bible of the church, and is interpreted within it, and is delivered by it. And as I said before, it's our bishops who decided what is Bible. And they knew what it was from tradition, transmitted to them verbally as well as in practice in the liturgy. Only the books that were from the 1st century were read in the services. And that's how they knew. And scholars today discover that all the books of the New Testament are all from the 1st century. Well, those guys knew because it was their Bible. So, in reaction to Lugaris, Dositheos says, every heresy has received the divine scriptures, but perversely interpreted them. Hence, if the church were to bow to the views of people like Lugaris and Calvin, for example, he says, the Catholic Orthodox Church, would not, as it has done by the grace of Christ, continue to be the church until this day, holding the same doctrine of faith, but would have been rent into innumerable parties and be subject to heresies. Neither would the church be holy, the pillar and ground of the truth, without spot and wrinkle, but would be the church of the malignant. And in the footnote I have the quote from this professor, Randall Balmer of Princeton University, in his article Sola Scriptura, the Protestant Reformation and the Eastern Orthodox Church. He says that had Dositheos and his ink lived to see, for example, the rise of millennial sects and the concomitant splintering of American religion a couple of centuries later, they would have taken grim satisfaction that their judgment had been prudent. Okay?
You want to end on that note? You want to end on that note?
You want to?
Sure.
I have my conclusions.
Okay.
If you...
2 minutes?
Yeah, let me do my conclusions and then we... Discussion and conclusions. Even if the reformers were driven by political motives in their approach to the East, it is clear from the examination of the communications of Melanchthon and the two beginning theologians to the two Orthodox patriarchs that there was a sincere attempt on their part to discover common ground, as well as a linguistic theological idiom which would express their positions more clearly, with the ultimate purpose of bringing the two sides together. Yet the effort failed. Where exactly was the problem? What can we modern Christians of both East and West learn from this dialogue that could help us achieve a better result? The reformers thought that they had much in common with the Orthodox, and yet the patriarchs felt insulted by by what they received on paper. The reformers kept repeating their positions, which they were unwittingly drawing from a theological system completely foreign to the East, as it had developed mostly after the alienation initiated with Charlemagne. Their perspective was coming from a rationalistic and juridical theological approach with its roots in Augustine, Aquinas, and Anselm. They were completely ignoring the spiritual authority of the early Christian fathers of the Church, both in the interpretation of the Scriptures with respect to the establishment of theological doctrine, as well as the mystical approach with regard to the relationship with God and human salvation. Jeremias felt that the reformers were disregarding the importance of the role of the fathers in theology, even as Melanchthon was able to use theological language which imitated the Greek patristic idiom. Yes, the reformers were genuinely trying to approach the East, but could not escape from the de facto establishment in which their thought was formed. They knew that there was a church before Charlemagne which had no medieval papacy, no indulgences, and no purgatory. They began to look toward it, but could not escape from what I call the Bermuda Triangle of Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas. My question is, does the Christian West have its roots also in the East? Think about that. Where all the theological debates of the first millennium took place, on the Cappadocian Fathers, Basil the Great, Gregory the Theologian, and Gregory of Nyssa, part of the Western spiritual heritage. Aren't Athanasius and Chrysostom revered in the West as heroes, as we said yesterday, saints and doctors of the Church? If the answer is yes, then the question arises, why do Protestants and Roman theologians alike, even until today, always go back to more recent Roman Catholic fathers and doctors to draw wisdom for their theology? Why is Augustine more important than his predecessors of the East? Why is Thomas Aquinas a better source of theology and theological methodology than Basil and the two Gregories, whose Greek philosophical learning was far deeper and more natural to them than to most others after them? Why is Anselm of Canterbury or Peter Abelard better sources of salvation theology than Irenaeus of Lyon, Origen, and Athanasius? Why weren't the ancient fathers consulted before the reformers began to build their new theories of salvation, like the penal substitutionary and the moral exemplar theories of atonement? Why are Western theologians still ignoring their own roots in the East? And yet, there is one example of a reformer, and I thank Charles for this, because he opened my eyes to him, from the 18th century, that can perhaps help us in this quest. This was John Wesley, an Anglican priest, who managed to transcend the bonds of Western neo-theologisms and return to the common Christian heritage of the Greek fathers. Going back to what he calls primitive Christianity, he took from the early Christians the concept of salvation as the healing of humanity. The Christ event ceased for him to be a legal transaction between God and the devil, or a punishment of the Son by the Father for the satisfaction of honor, or for the appeasement of an angry God. Following Irenaeus, Origen, and Athanasius, he saw Christ's incarnation as the loving condescension of God in order to lift up humanity and bring it closer to divinity. For God became man so that man may be deified. Following the thought of Gregory the Theologian, he saw the incarnation as God assuming humanity to heal it, for what is not assumed cannot be healed. The idea of judgment and juridical justification gave way in his understanding to allow for God's love and transforming power for the perfecting and sanctification of fallen humanity. Wesley recognized in the early fathers that in the process of salvation, man's free will participates with the free-flowing grace of God, because the image of God in man has not been completely destroyed by the fall, as Augustine had thought. It was only distorted and disfigured, and can still exercise its free will to choose the good. It can still respond to the love of God so that man may be transformed and reach sanctification, or theosis. Wesley incorporates the practical ascetic teachings of the fathers, fasting, confession, prayer, and the Eucharist, into a specific method for the modern man to assist him in his willful transformation by God's grace and love into a new, renewed, and healed man. Hence the terms Methodism and Methodist Church were adopted. It is my estimation that this is the place where East and West need to meet, not at the Reformation, nor at the Roman post-Charlemagne rationalistic and humanistic neo-theological production line of ideas. We cannot meet at the unchecked juridical Augustinian river of thought that did not take into account carefully the theological tradition before him. But we can only meet in what I call the golden era of the common Eastern Christian heritage of the 2nd to the 5th centuries, which offers both the ascetic, disciplined intellectual approach as well as the rich mystical symposium of spiritual offerings drawn from the centuries of Christian suffering and sacrifice. The lessons to be learned will be many. Salvation will be seen not as a juridical transaction, but in the light of the resurrection and the transformation of humanity in the Theanthropos, Christ, who is God and man, Theanthropos, the incarnate Logos, who defeated sin in his flesh, abolished death by death, and raised human nature, deified it and glorified it as he ascended to heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. That's salvation. The true unity of Christianity can only be achieved in the one church, which will be in continuity and concord with this primitive Christianity. It will only be within this same primitive Christianity where Christology was debated and clarified, that the great chasm between primitive Christianity and the modern salvation theories will be breached. I feel today that I have come here to Wittenberg. For me, it's a moving experience from that particular perspective. That having gone through all of this and seen the debates and the conflicts, I feel today that I've come here in the motherland of Luther and Melanchthon, at ground zero of the Reformation, to the Church of Wittenberg and its modern offspring, as an ambassador of the ancient Orthodox patriarchs Joseph and Jeremias, in person, to suggest a return to the ancient roots and the common Christian heritage which precedes Augustine, Charlemagne, and the medieval papacy of supremacy and infallibility. I come to suggest a return to the time before the invention of odd neo-theologies of atonement, and I'm not trying to insult anyone, and far before the introduction of indulgences and purgatory. Having experienced some of the pain and suffering of the consequences of these divisions wrought by the Reformation, I propose the return to the ancient church, its life and practices, its teaching and worship. These, I believe, will be the only effective way to help jumpstart the process of attaining the union and communion of all Christians, which Melanchthon and his friends desired so much but failed to accomplish. In other words, we need to first humbly come into communion with the primitive church, learn how to speak the same theological idiom, as well as understand it in the same way. Then we will be able to initiate a sensible and comprehensible dialogue with each other, beginning always with the same theological presuppositions and remaining always on the same page. As the foundation gets established, we're building, then we'll be able to address all the other new ideas developed in the subsequent centuries and decide what fits and what does not. Because today Christianity offers so many conflicting ideas, so many conflicting theologies that don't make any sense if you look at them together. Until then, we will continue to be broken and divided, unable to communicate clearly with one another of events of one another. I think that's the end.